Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Realignment YouTube channel. We have a very exciting interview today. It's with author Brad Stone of Bloomberg. So he's the senior executive editor for the global technology at Bloomberg, but he's also, for our purposes, author of Amazon Unbound, another book called The Upstarts about Uber and Airbnb, and The Everything Store, the original biography of Jeff Bezos and tale of that amazing company. So I wonder what we're going to be talking about with him today, Marshall.
To make it even more obvious, we are discussing Amazon, Silicon Valley, especially after COVID. Brad is great because Brad has just written the definitive series of books on this company. The first book, The Everything Store, covers the period from Amazon's origins in the 1990s up until around 2013. Brad makes a joke about how he was giving speeches after he wrote this book. And after 4 years, he really realized he knew nothing about Amazon because so much changed in this period. This is when you see AWS blow up. So if you're a conservative and you follow the Parler debate, that's coming into play. You see Amazon Prime Video launch, the Whole Foods acquisition, purchase of the Washington Post. The whole point here is the Unbound in the title is just referring to Amazon and Jeff Bezos' ambition touching basically everything in our society today. This is a really great follow-up to our conversation with Alec MacGillis a few months ago because Alec was talking about Amazon in the context of America. Brad is really here to explain how everything within Amazon works and why that matters to almost anything you can imagine.
Yeah, I love Brad's work. He does an amazing job of just chronicling these companies. Everything Store was really a huge book for me because it just told me the story of retail in the 21st century, about how the Everything Store was actually a revolutionary concept in terms of utilizing zero marginal cost businesses for Amazon, how it would work on the internet, and then Bezos realizing all of that in the mid 1990s and actually making it happen, which is crazy that he actually did it. So I find the company fascinating, both in terms of its humongous power over America's labor market, over our internet and more. And it was a really great conversation.
Brad Stone, welcome to the Realignment.
Thanks, guys.
It's good to see you, Brad.
So Brad, here's where I want to start. You've written the two defining books on Amazon. I guess this has come out very recently, so we can't quite call this one defining, but at least there's a narrative arc we could play with here. In the first book, you're obviously covering the company's origin story up until the 2010s, and this book is really the period ever since then. There's a funny appearance on a podcast where you've made a reference to talking about Amazon for 4 years and eventually realizing you no longer knew exactly what you were talking about because everything had changed so much. So I think that's a good way of framing this. So to start off, you're a reporter, so I'm not expecting you to give an exact answer to this. But how would someone go about determining whether Amazon is a net positive or a net negative for the country? Because in so many of the books, the podcasts, we had Alec MacGillis on a few months back, there's this very clear implication that Amazon is either really bad or it's really good or it's meh. How should we think about the question itself?
It's one of the, I think, defining questions in the book, and one perhaps in the end that I kind of don't answer. Right? Because I feel like it's sort of unknowable. I think that what we need to do is understand the story, understand the impact, the clear, impact that it has on the labor market and on local commerce and on competition globally. But, personally, I don't come at it as a critic, and I want to be really clear-eyed about the benefits, right? I'm a Prime member and an Echo owner and watch the TV shows and movies and order the groceries. And it was a lifeline during the pandemic. And so, what I'm trying to do is kind of tell the story, get people to understand both sides of the ledger, and then maybe make their own decision. I also think that ultimately, Amazon, like our kind of technological revolution over the span of my lifetime, is, an aspect of public life, and it's not going away. So in some ways, it's sort of a meaningless question to ask, right? We can address the negatives in Amazon's conduct and force it through activism or employee voices or through antitrust regulation to do better. But it's not like we're going to wipe it out and move to a hypothetical alternate universe where it doesn't exist. We can't go back to the days before e-commerce and Alexa and ebooks and cloud computing. And so in some ways, it's really just our responsibility to understand it and make better decisions on how we, kind of force it to change.
Probably the thing that frustrates me the most here in DC is looping things in and just not really know what you're talking about. So people will be like, big tech is out of control. And so I'm like, okay, well, what do you mean by that? And they're like, well, Apple, Google, Facebook, and Amazon. I'm like, so you just named a retail company, a hardware company, a search engine, and a social network. I agree, all four are out of control in their own ways. That being said, you should probably know what you're talking about whenever you're going to level an accusation. So let's start with the critics of Amazon. What do they get right? And then what do they get wrong? Let's start with right.
Right. Well, it's interesting because I think I actually, you're raising an issue where I sort of feel passionate about. Like there's so much, clueless commentary from folks who were talking about Walmart for 10 years, and Walmart is not even part of their vocabulary anymore. And Amazon's the big bad boogeyman. And there's not a great understanding of how the internet works and how many alternatives there are. They talk about Amazon's, reach and the number of people who start their product searches on Amazon as being some sort of captive audience, when really an alternative is a browser tab away, the most minimum of effort to go compare a price or to look at Walmart or search on Google. And, and then, the fact is that like all those companies you listed are competing with each other, right, on the margins, right? Amazon's greatest competition in cloud computing is Microsoft, a bigger company by market cap. And its biggest competitor in pure retail in the West is Walmart, a bigger company by sales. And and its diffuse focus on so many things has opened up pockets of real opportunity for competitors like Shopify. And so, what gets me a little bit is maybe the weak understanding by some of the more prominent critics of how complex these issues are. And then when you get to the regulatory proceedings in Washington, at least, the whole thing is cast, in further confusion by, not to get too political here, but the Republican Party, turning these events into a circus by seizing upon the regulation or discrimination against conservative voices, which, when Jeff Bezos is sitting in the room next to Zuckerberg and Sundar Pichai, has nothing to do.
He'll
not
take that
really
deal all day long.
It's
like,
just
I'll just sit here. It's all good.
It's a distraction. And so, what they get right is, I think there's a really productive focus on Amazon's use of data and its marketplace and with its private label products, and maybe the very opaque ties between AWS and Amazon retail and Amazon devices. Those are things like, as a journalist, I want to understand better, and that Amazon goes to great lengths to obscure. And so the better understanding we can get of this company and how it advantages itself in even small ways, I think would be a really good outcome for the current regulatory processes that are underway.
Yeah, I've heard you say the critics often don't understand how the internet works point enough. Could you just delve into that a bit and explain what you are really getting at, especially as relates to the questions of monopoly in that part?
Yeah, what does lock-in mean? What does it mean that Amazon controls a customer or controls a seller? Because we do have a lot of choices, right? And Amazon is operating in market categories where, they don't really even have a majority of the market share. In retail, in e-commerce itself, you've seen from various data sources that it's a 40 to 50% player in North America, its strongest market. You go back to Microsoft in the 90s when it had a 95% command of Windows, of operating system market share. So its market power is, less significant. I mean, surely we can identify areas like books and ebooks where they have a larger stake, and where their conduct might deserve a little bit more scrutiny. And then when you get even to marketplace sellers, there are choices now. Amazon obviously has become the biggest star in the sky, but there are other marketplaces in other countries and even in the US. So I just think it's like understanding the competitive dynamics, the ease with which you can find alternatives even if you're a seller, and that the anti-competitive conduct is there, but it's a lot more subtle, and Amazon goes to great lengths to disguise it. And and we have to think really hard when we design conduct remedies to make sure we're not just singling Amazon out for behavior that is common in the retail business, that is a tried and true practice of retail for decades, like private label products. And that whatever we do, we don't make Amazon stronger, because that is a possibility. That you pass regulation and it in some ways emboldens the company because it restricts a practice that is industry wide.
So I want to pick up on something you said a little earlier when you described Amazon as just being a facet of the society we live in. And, the first book was obviously titled The Everything Store. So relating to your point about the internet, is an everything store, quote unquote, basically inevitable then? Because that seems to be what you're suggesting there.
I mean, the internet is itself an everything store, right? Even the things that Amazon doesn't sell, automobiles or life insurance, we can go find on the internet. And Bezos had that vision early on that even if you didn't have it in your warehouse downstairs in the basement, you could eventually go find it. And so the internet made real the idea of a store with infinite shelves. But yeah, there are competitive dynamics of the internet now that allow for, endless competition and, what the competitive dynamic in one country being different than, next door. And even in countries that Amazon doesn't operate, its site is accessible, and then vice versa for Alibaba and other competitors. So yeah, I mean, the internet really upends, I think, a lot of our notions. And look, I mean, a lot of very smart people get this. I mean, the thinkers that the Biden administration has brought in, like Lena Khan, whose appointment is currently under review for the FTC, and Tim Wu, who's joining the White House, like they have written books and esteemed law papers about this dynamic and urged really a rethinking of antitrust law to address some of these competitive dynamics that are unique to our internet age.
Let's get into that, though. I'm not sure if they do understand it. And because I'm somebody who was definitely much more of the Tim Wu, Matt Stoller, Lena Khan mindset probably like 2 years ago, I had read a very impactful essay by Ben Thompson, and actually it was underscored to me by Andrew Yang, which is that the internet naturally selects for monopolies. And in a zero marginal cost business, there really should be one everything store. As in, and I was talking about this with Marshall earlier about the Walmart discourse. It makes a lot more sense to break up Walmart. Walmart has a geographical footprint, has the empirical marginal cost of having to open stores all across the country. If you broke up Walmart, the consumer in California is not going to be hurt because they're just going to go whatever their baby Walmart is. Whereas if you broke up Amazon, it impacts every consumer in the country by having to go to like 9 different websites to buy diapers or to buy like a coffee mug or to buy like a notebook. I mean, that doesn't make any sense at all. And this isn't even just using the consumer welfare standard. This even comes down to, price, bargaining, and more. It just doesn't seem to make sense on any front whenever we try to assess it through antitrust. So I'm curious from your perspective, I've been writing about the internet for a long time, which is that if we start to accept that the internet is just so physiologically different than the geographical footprint, does antitrust even make sense? Or does it really mean that we have to discuss everything in terms of regulation? So like you were saying, and like you write in your book, we're talking about private labels. Okay, yeah, but Walmart just simply doesn't have the same level to track its customers the way that Amazon does. Amazon actually does have a very unique advantage in the private label business. Same thing in terms of the regulation on their own platform of counterfeits being unfair, about accessibility of the Chinese market. These are all like discrete policy problems that I'm like, oh, I could see a government agency wanting to fix that. But I don't see why antitrust is going to solve a lot of these problems.
Well, I mean, I take your point. I do think we need to be careful that we're not allowing these companies. I mean, they have so many advantages, access to capital, access to the most talented engineers, these self-perpetuating systems that get larger and larger. And we have to be careful that they're not leveraging their advantages into adjacent markets. And that is really the issue with the private label business, which I think is so easily understandable to most people. Like Amazon has a vast data set of third-party sales, and they can figure out that, okay, this laptop stand is selling well, and suddenly they've gone to the same factory as the seller and are selling it under an Amazon Basics label for cheaper. And by the way, Amazon's placing it ahead of the third-party seller in search results. That feels funny. It smells wrong. And it goes back to Microsoft trying to muscle into the operating system market into the browser market in the 90s. And so that kind of leverage, we see it across the board, Google into, streaming video and other kind of search result categories, Amazon into, healthcare, right? Can they use the staging ground of cloud services and retail, in fair ways, but perhaps in unfair ways to go and dominate a whole new product category? And that's where I feel like that maybe the various governments have a role to play in being kind of the cops to ensure good behavior in the marketplace.
Yeah. So something that is just interesting is you had a good statement where you made the point that disruption in these industries is always around the corner. And I think if we were having this conversation in 2015, 2016, 2017, there'd be a lot more skepticism for me around that point. You'd be seeing, well, Facebook just beat Snapchat and they beat Instagram and Google's in a great place, so on and so on and so on. But now in the year since then, Snap has recovered. TikTok, despite we're totally putting the national security arguments to the side here, TikTok completely has challenged Facebook's dominance. And, there's the joke about young people not using Facebook. So I think it is actually pretty clear in the year 2021 that the disruption argument is a lot different than it used to look. How should we think of a company like Amazon getting disrupted? And is this something that Bezos and Amazon leadership are actively concerned about, which I'm guessing they are?
Yeah, they always talk about it. I mentioned the example of Shopify before, but I think it's sort of interesting to look at it a little bit further. So Amazon's trying to be everywhere. It's the everything store. It wants to be everything to everyone, and so it's got a marketplace side where it's allowing third-party sellers, often overseas, sometimes from China, to sell globally, in addition to a curated kind of brand-centric retail component. And the two are at war. And I tell the story over and over in the book because, a Nike is never going to feel comfortable when you have a whole site full of sneakers with brand insignias that aren't swooshes, but they look somewhat like it. And they've got crazy names. And by the way, they're much cheaper. And so, Amazon tries to cater to everyone, but clearly they've made a bet that the uninhibited selection of marketplace is something that customers want. Nike has left Amazon, and a Shopify comes around, and with laser-eyed focus on just the brand and the curated store opportunity, it has built, and I don't have the number at my fingers, but a multi-billion-dollar business and cleaved off a part of Amazon's opportunity. So I think it's what you're saying, Marshall. It's like in this day and age, every company's hegemony is only as secure as somebody having a great idea in a garage and pursuing it with focus.
And one quick thing on this, actually, and this is a more meta question for you as a editor, author, etc. I'm not trying to do the dunk on DC show, but I think the part that's interesting to me is that narratives tend to go on a little past where they can perpetuate. So in the sense that I don't think, at least in the public policy discourse, the idea that you can, I don't think it's possible to, let me put it a better way. The idea that there is no way to disrupt the big four, big five tech giants just doesn't seem to be in the moment accurate right now. And we're still operating off of a 2-year behind narrative. How do you think of narratives, quote unquote,
right,
in the tech industry?
Well, I mean, I do feel like despite everything I said, I'll now make the contradicting statement that while there are pockets of opportunity, it's really hard to imagine anyone challenging or even slowing down Amazon as a whole. And then you look at Google and the self-perpetuating advantages of, collecting the data to constantly improve search. And yes, there are little rivals like DuckDuckGo that, are, affectionately regarded, but no one's, Facebook is the one where you mentioned TikTok, and like my household is a TikTok household and Facebook never comes into it. And I do think they're maybe a little bit more vulnerable, and that the antitrust argument against Facebook is a little flimsier. But, the narrative of, big tech companies getting bigger, having all the advantages during the pandemic, using data to strengthen their hold on the economy, that's the story that I tell in this book. And it's the story of the last couple of years. And it's not, it's not changing. There are still opportunities for innovation and entrepreneurship, but I don't see any signs that the Amazon boulder rolling downhill is slowing down. If anything, it feels like it's gathering speed.
Yeah, I think that's important. And I'm realizing, Jay Carney, if he's listening to this, he's like, yes, they're using my talking points. Disruption's right around the corner. He's like, what does de-ranking us up even mean? That's terrible for the consumer. Yeah, like I understand. And I mean, I'm somebody very skeptical of Amazon. I'm somebody who really does understand, and this is an Alec McGillis point, which is that the existence of it is actually changing America. But I also understand that that's also somewhat intrinsic to American free market capitalism, and that's changed like 3 or 4 different times. But when you do look at the power and you look at the pandemic, I mean, becoming the second largest employer in the United States, having that much leverage and power over the labor market, these are fundamental questions. We have been resolving this for the last 150 years. The tension between labor and capital will always remain. So from that perspective, just talk about what Amazon means to America as like part of our social fabric. Because I do think, this is a Scott Galloway point he makes all the time, which is that like Amazon has more of a relationship with American households than people who put up Christmas trees. Amazon is more American than apple pie. And I think that is just something that I've tried to repeat here because I don't think people understand how in the zeitgeist of all of our households that this company is. And that is a tremendous amount of power that we should be skeptical of, in my opinion.
Yeah. I can't tell you the number of times I've been at a restaurant or at a cafe and overheard the table next door some discussion of Amazon and or Alexa or their orders, or here in Silicon Valley a business discussion about AWS. It does feel like it's in the, and of course as an Amazon journalist, I'm sort of eavesdropping on everyone, but it's not a rare occurrence. And yeah, the idea of how integrated this company is into our lives, into our communities. It's remarkable. There's no Super Bowl anymore without an Amazon ad. The ads are everywhere. And this was a company and a CEO who was skeptical about advertising just 10 years ago and felt like it was wasted money. And obviously, and this is well drawn in Alec's book, is how impactful it has been in smaller communities where economic opportunity was wiped out, not by Amazon, but by successive decades of churn and change in the American economy and the globalization of manufacturing and the battle between unions and labor organizers. And, in some ways, Amazon offers opportunity in places where there hasn't been enough of it. And the company is receptive to the criticism, and it's why they've tried to get, lead with their chin and get out in front on like a high wage. But, and I hope this really comes through in my book, they are at heart really anti-union. And Jay, to your point, if he's listening, will maybe argue that point. But, that Bezos said to his colleagues early on that the biggest risk to the company was an entrenched and activist workforce of the kind that he believed had hobbled the U.S. automakers, generations before. And we see it in Bessemer, Alabama, and everywhere, how they fight tooth and nail to prevent these organizing activities in their facilities.
Yeah, this is something I also wanted to pick up on, which is that I found that entire episode fascinating because I read your first book, The Everything Store. And Bezos is this just impeccable communicator. You genuinely almost respect it. You're like, this guy, laser focus on the mission, never drifts away. Then I realized, I started reading your book, what happened around the Bessemer situation started to make more sense, which is he wanted to clap back at Trump for some reason in 2015. And his whole staff was like, dude, this is a terrible idea. You're just going to feed the beast. You're going to become part of the discourse. And he's like, no, I'm going to do it. And he did. And it turned out exactly that way. I saw this. I was shocked whenever I saw the Amazon account tweeting back at Representative Mark Pocan, where they're like, you don't really believe the story about, Amazon workers peeing in bottles. And I was like, what the hell is going on here? Everybody knows that's true. And then they have to come out and be like, we're sorry. It turns out it is true.
Walk back.
And it turns out that this is ordered from Bezos himself. And I remember just being like, what the hell happened to Jeff Bezos? Because I had just read your book, because in a way, the story of Amazon is the story of this one man. This is part of the problem with imbuing so much power and wealth in a single individual. How do you explain that change within Jeff Bezos, the man himself, from going to a point where, you probably agree with this, 2005 Bezos would never do that. Never. And yet now he's like, you know what? Screw you. You're not going to talk shit about my company. I'm coming right after you. And it doesn't matter how impetuous I look in this situation.
Right. I mean, a couple things have happened. One, back then, they were content to, as they said, be misunderstood. They put up the walls, they hid in Seattle, and they didn't care what people said about them. It didn't seem to matter. Their goal at the time was get the latest Harry Potter book to customers on the day of publication, and the rest would take care of itself. And then, and this is, I think, the story I tell in this book, they become, a bigger company, tightly integrated with their community and other communities, a subject of national discourse. They kind of dislodge Walmart as like the big boogeyman of retail in the public imagination. It's no longer enough to be misunderstood. They got to get out there and battle. And that's the kind of punchiness we see in their public pronouncements. But at the same time, what happens is Bezos, his feet leave this earth, right? He is the wealthiest guy in the world. He's enjoying hobnobbing with the elites in Hollywood and in DC. He's eating iguana and sampling a single cow burger and building a yacht. And he's a little out of touch, I think, with, well, certainly the driver that's making an Amazon delivery, and also probably regular, mortal tastes. And so it can feel a little tone deaf in just the way you'd expect from like a billionaire micromanaging media strategy when he really doesn't know what is happening on the ground. Do you guys remember during the pandemic where he had an Instagram video of him touring a fulfillment center outside of Dallas?
It was like the first time in years, right?
It just felt so weird, right? Like had he really been in one of these things in a decade, I felt like he was sort of seeing it for the first time in a long while. So yeah, I feel like he's maybe lost a little bit of touch. And when you've had, a team of people catering to your every need and moving in rarefied society, that is not surprising.
Yeah. This actually came up when I was reading the book, but also when you just made the point about control over the workforce, because looking at the tech industry as a whole, this seems like a very white collar, blue collar phenomenon. And I'm not going to ask you to comment on AGM at Apple, but on a broader level, there is this very clear phenomenon where white collar professionals in the tech industry, you see this with Project Maven, you see this with the U.S. Working with the U.S. government with ICE, working with the U.S. military, et cetera, are gaining more and more control relative to what you would think they would have in the past. I don't see a world where 2005 Amazon is having employee conflicts over working with the U.S. military, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So can you just comment on the increasing vocalness of white collar professionals in the industry, really in contrast? And I guess Amazon is probably the only one of these companies that has a significant blue collar workforce. I'd just love to hear how you think this dynamic is playing out.
It's interesting because this has been one of the defining stories of Silicon Valley over the past few years. And the employee protests, I think, have gathered into a full-fledged kind of conflagration at Google and really given the company a black eye and changed its policy. You mentioned a few instances, but Google pulled out of the Jedi contract bidding, maybe because it knew it would lose, but in part because employees were objecting to it. But at Amazon, I see it more as little brush fires. And they have, moved swiftly and ruthlessly to stamp them out. And so there were climate protests inside Amazon, and Amazon fired the leaders. There's no way to really justify it. And Amazon tries by saying that they violated some policy or another, but really they are basically punishing the squeaky wheels. And then obviously, in the fulfillment centers, you had the employees in Staten Island and elsewhere that were protesting safety conditions in the spring of 2020, and Amazon fired them. And it's as if they are unwilling to accept any internal dissent. And they don't want the kind of out of control, conflagration that they see at Google and other companies. And it's probably the culture that Bezos has set up, and they know they're going to take a black eye in the short term, but they're avoiding this kind of internal activist dissent in the long term. They're making a really hardcore decision. And, I think they've lost some executives because of it. People look back and think this is something that is really unexcusable and maybe a little rotten in the corporate culture.
Mm-hmm. I want to take a total pivot to another topic because there was another quick reference you made in the book, which I don't know how deeply you follow debates on the American right in DC, but it was a really revelatory line you were referencing during the HQ2 saga. So when Amazon is making decisions around where they're going to place the second headquarters, which eventually ended up with the combination Hudson, the Hudson Yards expansion, DC, but Atlanta, which was a final near the final spot, didn't end up getting it because Amazon noted that the Georgia state legislature had literally removed tax breaks on an airline over its decision to not support work with, et cetera, the NRA. And that was just interesting to me because a lot of the time, a lot of our listeners would think about these debates of, well, there's this issue of woke capital and you see corporations getting more and more active with their politics. And if you're someone who doesn't agree with those decisions, what can you do to affect that behavior? And an argument you see from folks is, well, the reason why companies, whether it's, the NCAA isn't quite technically a company, but the reason why the NCAA will make certain decisions, or the reason why Pepsi makes certain decisions is because they do not believe they will suffer political consequences. But in that anecdote, Amazon's like, okay, yeah, we're probably going to make decisions that are political. We probably can't go to certain states. So can you just comment on, I don't know if you probably didn't mean anything by including that line, but that for me, it really just opened up wait a second, this has basically already been tested. So can you just comment on this phenomenon? Because it's just fascinating from a political perspective.
Yeah, I mean, Amazon initiates the HQ2 process in 2017 because they feel like their politics and their MO were on trial in Seattle, right? And that they had, were viewed as sort of an enemy in a community that they felt they had built up, but were being sort of tried and convicted for things like gentrification, rising home prices, and homelessness. And so they initiate this process. And they're running away from a political storm. And so in the site selection process, and I have all the memos and all the decision making in this chapter in the book, I look at their thinking in cities like Atlanta and Raleigh and LA. And what pops up in Atlanta, as you mentioned, but also in the others, is, are we running from one storm into another, where our the political leanings of the company are going to be on trial. And they didn't want that, and Atlanta around Delta, but in Raleigh, it was on the bathroom bill in North Carolina. Are they going to be wading into turbulent political waters, or being seen as validating, in the case of the bathroom bill, a very controversial, political stance that the state was making. So the great irony is they tried to avoid all that and ran headlong into just another storm in Queens.
Probably the worst storm. Like out of all of those three outcomes, the one which definitely was the most aggressive.
Right. And maybe they couldn't see the election of AOC, or there was the fact that De Blasio was so hated, or Cuomo had no control over the local city council. But it goes back to what we were saying about Jeff Bezos and his feet on the ground, right? They just didn't. They made a very far off decision from Seattle, not understanding the dynamics on the ground, the political dynamics in New York City. And, they ran headlong into a disaster.
Yeah. And yet they did read one city well. And I do think that is Washington, which is Bezos is here all the time. He's got the biggest house in the entire city. He's, Alfalfa Club, Gridiron Club. Funnily enough, I actually worked out at the gym across from him. And I was like, is that Jeff Bezos?
When was this?
Right after the Lauren Sanchez thing. And I was like, you ever heard of Signal, dude? He's like working out. And then
if there's ever a moment not to walk up to Jeff Bezos in a public setting, it was then.
I will attest to this. The guy is jacked. He goes extraordinarily hard. And I was very impressed by it. And I just couldn't believe that the richest man in the world was working out at a public gym, but that's amazing. And one of the things that I'm getting to is that Amazon has seemed to understand politics in a very astute way, which actually kind of brings us to AWS, which is something I really want to discuss with you. I don't think most people in Washington really understood what AWS even was. Has about 45% or something, whatever, right, of the cloud market. Huge servicer, essentially is the platform on which many Silicon Valley companies are able to launch off of because they can, at a very low cost, rent server space, something they used to have to take out millions of dollars in funding in order to get. However, a lot of people found out during the Parler thing that AWS can actually just decide in order to essentially deplatform an entire website. And it led to a larger discussion of like AWS needs to be pulled from Amazon. It became part of the antitrust decision, which is AWS makes billions of dollars for Amazon, one of the most profitable parts of the business. It's subsidizing, the rest of their retail, etc. Can you just explain and maybe disentangle some of the arguments both around Parler, but also the intrinsic nature of AWS to Amazon as a company? A famous Gallowayism is that he just thinks that Bezos is, or Jassy or whomever is just going to spin off AWS just so they don't even have to deal with the antitrust concern in the future.
I do love Scott Galloway, but he does just sort of generously, is generously
he's got to
wrong
take for everything. He's got to take for everything,
and he knows that often half the time he'll be really visibly wrong, and he doesn't care. And I've told him, I actually told him I thought he was wrong about AWS. And he was wrong about this idea that AWS is the secret funding source for retail. And that is not how Bezos runs the business. AWS is extremely profitable, and it goes to build more AWS. It is building more data centers, expanding into more countries, and developing more services because it is in a foot race with Google and Microsoft and IBM and Oracle. If there is a service that is the secret kind of gold mine for Amazon, it's advertising, a super high margin business. And that money is going into Prime Video and probably new products and Alexa expansion. But, so spinning off AWS is, first of all, you'd have, instead of one big Amazon, you'd have two little, let's call them baby Bezoses running around dominating in just the same way. So it wouldn't change anything.
Right.
And it might be sort of easy to split them apart because, as I say, they're run somewhat independently. They do, I think, nourish each other in some small ways. Alexa is a consumer-facing application of AWS. The retail business is AWS's biggest partner and beta tester. Retail gets wholesale rates from AWS most likely, but I don't think it really slows down any of the components and probably unlocks a lot of value. The last point is they're just never going to do it voluntarily, at least in the near future, because they don't seem to really even entertain that kind of financial engineering, right? For the same reason they don't give a dividend or buy back stock. It's, Bezos is empire building, and, all this stuff is under one roof, and there are connections, the little advantages that he ties between all the properties, and that's been very successful. So unless that is, forced upon them one day, seems unlikely in the near term, or unless in some distant future Bezos has receded from view and investors clamor upon an Amazon whose stock price hasn't grown in a long time, again, a hypothetical, you could kind of see it, and then you question what real difference would it make.
Yeah, I want to talk about the advertising real quick because I had a really visceral reaction to the part of the book where they were debating whether or not to preference brands that advertised in the search, because I just moved, I'm buying furniture, and it's actually a disaster because there's all this, I won't say it's junk, but I just can't really trust the Amazon search function because so much of what at the top of it is sponsored posts. So can you just talk about the decision making around that space? Because that relates back to the start of our conversation around what happens when what happens when there's another tab away, because I actually went to different tabs because it was difficult to search for generic consumer items given that decision they made.
And let me say that the furniture that's behind you right now looks fantastic. So clearly you found some good stuff. But, I feel like if there's a turning point in the book, you've put your finger on it, because this was a company that for so long, chanted the cause, the cry of the customers, totally customer focused. And yet they're experimenting and they're growing their ad business and nothing's really working. And around 2005, Bezos, agrees that they could try sponsored ads at the top of search results, like Google has. And Amazon pays Google billions of dollars a year. And it works. And it makes a lot of money, but they see that there's a drop-off, a fall-off in customer satisfaction. And they kind of don't know over the long term how big that will be. But Bezos agrees, he'll accept the decrease in customer satisfaction and finding what customers are looking for the money that will go and invest in his dreams of Hollywood and the future of entertainment and inventive new devices and, owning the networked home and who knows what else. And that has been a tremendous business. I think was like $5 billion in that other category in the last quarter. And it's funding all sorts of stuff. Amazon might buy MGM, this week or next, in part because they can. They're building an ad business across video, which is a lot of promise. And yet, to your point, Marshall, it's like you search for something on Amazon, you have to wonder what happened to my neatly organized, taxonomy of useful products. It's a mess right now. And so they've compromised, which I think was, remarkable for Amazon and speaks to maybe some of Bezos's personal ambitions of empire building and becoming a force in Hollywood.
Yeah, I always bring it back. It's like a shift in Bezos changed the shift in the company and really changed a lot. And that's something that brings us to the Washington Post, our hometown newspaper here in DC, where Bezos buying it in 2013 was kind of one of those wow moments. I don't think people understood the significance of the time. And one thing that comes across in your book is that he didn't really understand what the hell he was getting into in terms of, oh, now all of a sudden you're a political society player here in Washington. Now, whenever your company, your paper is going to report on the president of the United States, they can take it out on you in terms of your company. You have a great line there where like the likely cost of the Washington Post was not $250 million. It was $10 billion on the Jedi contract, which I absolutely do think is true, even if Microsoft was the competitive bidder or whatever. So from that perspective, talk about Bezos and the Post, how he brings his tech mindset to the newspaper business, because 2013 is that total flashpoint. And it's funny, you have that anecdote about Bezos wondering, like, why don't we just hire more star writers and then we don't need editors? And so editors at the Washington Post actually sent the raw copy to Bezos to show how terrible it was. And side note, I actually shared some of that. I shared that anecdote with people who were at the Washington Post and they freaked out. They're like, what? And I was like, your copy could be sitting in Jeff's inbox. You have no idea. So just talk about it, both his own personal perspective of running the Post, how he views it. Is he actually hands off? And then what he ended up getting himself into in a way that I don't think he knew what he was doing back in 2013.
Well, yeah, we go back to 2013. It was circumstance. Don Graham, personal friend, was selling the paper. Maybe he saw it a little bit as a potential to burnish his public image. I have this memo in the first book about, him understanding and grappling with the idea that as the CEO of a big retailer, that there were some reputational risks, and he looked at what Walmart had been through. And, the savior of a national journalistic institution was probably a nice thing to add to his resume. But, one of the first things he does as the owner of the Washington Post is he rejects a couple of budgets that call on him to lose a lot of money personally. And, we do really need to give him credit for doing it the right way, putting the Post on firm ground, not with an open pocketbook, but a demand to bring him new products and lean more into digital and becoming a national an international media institution and not a local one, and being able to accept the risk of losing the analog business in favor of building a digital future. Now, on the political risks, it was a lack of all of our imagination to understand that Donald Trump could be elected and be so vituperative against his political and media enemies. But that was a ride Bezos went on. Amazon suffered in a whole bunch of ways, not just the Jedi contract. But, they came through. Bezos is seen, part of his complex public image is as the Post savior. He really wrapped himself up in the Post during the National Enquirer battle. So in a weird way, it's become a little bit of a shield for him. And he did it sort of improperly because his ownership of the Post had nothing to do with the Enquirer's pursuit of that story. But if you remember, he said it was a complexifier for him and that naturally people would be his enemies, even though he's conducting an affair out in the open. So, that was what was curious. But so I guess my point is that, the Post exacted a toll on Amazon, but it probably has benefited Bezos in a whole bunch of ways, some of which he could not have known back in 2013.
Yeah. Yeah. So for our last bit here, I want to go back to the more meta discussion about Silicon Valley. So your book, the book you wrote in between Amazon Unbound and the Everything store was called The Upstarts. It's really focused on Uber and Airbnb. And the reason why I enjoyed it so much is that, and I'm not saying this is what you're necessarily saying, but at least on my level, you basically took the idea embodied in Mark Andreessen's Software is Eating the World essay, aka you have this established set of legacy companies, industries, governments, etc., that are going to be challenged as everything effectively becomes technology, everything becomes software. And you see this is in your coverage of Airbnb and Uber, obviously the taxi industry and the hotel industry. So that is a very 2016, 2017 narrative. Even like the upstart part suggests it's the more libertarian side of Silicon Valley. It's the more like challenging power, challenging those lame taxi drivers. We're from DC. So once again, there's very little love lost for 2012 taxi industry. Yeah. A lot of my credit card reader is broken energy here, but that obviously is gone, and for reasons more complicated than Travis Kalanick obviously leaving. So sitting in 2021, I'm actually in New York City right now. So knock on wood, we're seeing the pandemic at least edge out a bit. We're seeing people start to plan for a post-COVID world at least. Where do you think just the narrative in Silicon Valley is? I just want to do a quick quote that also just came to mind. Eric Newcomer has an amazing Substack, and he had a really good post where he just said a key takeaway from the past year may be that tech didn't dream big enough, that there was the initial month or two where people didn't do any deals, there was less investment, but those people who did double down during this moment have a real opportunity. So I'm just curious, how would you sum up in this last bit the opportunity, or what you would say the narrative is in the space right now?
Well, it's enormous. I mean, big tech has gotten bigger. The playing field that was already tilted towards the big tech companies is now, even further angled in their direction. Airbnb and Uber, were hit particularly hard. Like we saw a major curtailing of their ambition. Airbnb, dropped the idea of activities on trips, dropped the idea of disrupting air travel, went back to its bread and butter, got rid of a lot of people, and navigated it pretty adroitly, I have to say. And then Uber, this big pivot to Uber Eats as its transportation business, got absolutely gutted, in a way that it couldn't have foreseen, seems to have made it through. And now the opportunity is opening back up. And and I think the old dreams will come back and they'll start adding more people. And, the challenge is always can you continue to hire and retain the best engineers, particularly when you're already public company, and the compensation and upside isn't as high as it could be. But I don't know. It's a good question. I mean, a lot of it will have to do, I guess, with the size and scale of the comeback, right? And will we feel as comfortable renting a home from someone else, now that we're all aware of the viral risks, or sharing, I don't even remember. What is the Uber carpool? Uber pool.
Right? Pool.
Yeah.
I took advantage of that, man.
Are people coming back to that? Are we doing that again? Yeah. With masks or without. And scooters, right? That was such the big new thing. And that now they just disappeared from city streets, at least here in the Bay Area. And when traffic comes back and things get busy again, will people feel less comfortable? And will we even be going back in the way that we were now that companies are offering more work from home flexibility? So I guess I'm gonna kind of give you a lame answer and say we kind of don't know. Certainly the big tech companies and Amazon itself has been entrenched, more powerful than ever. And the transportation companies I wrote about in the upstarts, I guess the size and fierceness of their comeback is still really to be determined and largely dependent on the pandemic recovery.
And something I just realized, I should have asked you this because you're an editor at a major news outlet. What do you think the future is for the Washington Post? Because I want to bookend it with a couple of things. So one, Bezos made a couple of decisions early on back in 13, 14 that really paid off during the Trump years, AKA move away from being a DC local regional paper, focus on national news. That's the definition of the Trump era. You go away from being a Facebook content farm to focusing on subscriptions, that space. But the obvious thing that's happening in the news industry right now is that interest in, national political news has cratered, and there is just a degree of subscription overload where you have the Post competing against the New York Times, the behemoth of the space, obviously. How do you think the shifts just over the past 3 or 4 months are going to play out for the decisions that he made 7 years ago?
Yeah. No, I think the Post is going to be fine, right? I don't worry about the Post. It's a differentiated brand, a loud, strong political voice. Interest and attention on political coverage will roar back with the next indignity that our lawmakers hand to us, or the next big election. It's and they've got the backing of Bezos, even in the lean years, and all these very subtle connections to Amazon products like Kindle Fire tablets and Prime membership. And if one day Bezos sells it, he'll have put it on strong footing, I believe. No, but I do worry about the smaller papers. I'm from Cleveland, Ohio. The Plain Dealer is a shadow of its former self. Communities all around the country and the world, some of them have no local community newspaper. And these were the glue that held together our communities and informed the populace and allowed them to make rational choices at the ballot box and held politicians to account. And so what I'd like to see, now that Bezos has had so much success with the Washington Post and has $200 billion at his disposal, is, let's back some small newspapers and I'll give them, access to the same, intellect and resources that he gave to the Washington Post, which so burnished his image. And not just Bezos, but Warren Buffett, who's pulled out of local newspapers, and my boss, Mike Bloomberg. Right, I do think there's a real public need for benefactors, or at least smart companies interested in the journalism and not just hedge funds, to go and rescue some of these small papers.
Yeah, I think it's really well said. Well, Brad, look, I know you got to get out of here. We really appreciate you joining us. Really loved all 3 of these books. It'll be available on our bookshop as well as on Amazon, where I hope I hope that they continue to give you some prime placement. And appreciate you joining us, sir.
Thanks, guys. I enjoyed it.